Lord Frost, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, friends of the Danube Institute. On behalf of my colleagues in the Institute, may I welcome you to the first lecture in a series on conservatism that I hope will become a fixture for all those in Budapest interested in the broad topic of the right side of politics. In this case, the topic is British conservatism, which attracts our attention because this year is an election year, and a Conservative government, which has held power for 14 years, is facing almost certain defeat on election day. Now, that sounds a rash prediction, but there is an unusually large consensus in Britain, excluding really only the official spokesman for the government, that there will be a significant defeat. Moreover, not only is a defeat generally foreseen, but it is also expected generally that the government's defeat will be something approaching a landslide, even potentially a defeat so severe that it might mean the end of the Tory party altogether. Now, this year will be the 190th anniversary of the Tory party's birth. It's often described with some justice as the most successful political party in world history. That's quite a boast, actually, but it's hard to think of a more successful political party, especially since rivals like the Soviet Communist Party have since dropped spectacularly out of the running. And in that 190 years, the Tory party has suffered very often a number of catastrophic defeats. For example, let me mention its 1906 defeat by the Liberals, its 1945 defeat by Attlee's Labour Party, its reduction to 197 seats by Tony Blair's New Labour in 1997. All of those defeats reduced the party to below 200 MPs in a House of Commons that was generally had about 600 or more. But it always came back fighting, and eventually it would win again. What are the odds of that happening again? Well, I don't know anyone who's better placed to answer that question than David Frost, the Right Honourable Lord Frost of Allington PC, CMG, whose career has been both distinguished and meteoric. Now, that's an odd combination, but the explanation is that his pre-political career was distinguished. He was the... he spent most of his career out of politics as a professional UK diplomat and civil servant, serving in such posts as British Ambassador to Denmark and as Europe Director in the Foreign Office. He served overseas in the mission to the EU in Brussels, the mission to the UN in New York, and in the British embassies in Paris and Nicosia. Between 2013 and 2016, he was later CEO of the UK's biggest trade association, the Scotch Whisky Association. I have a particular fondness for that because I was once stranded in London airport and found myself in the company of a group of Scotch whisky salesmen on a special trade to New York. We were kept overnight by BA, and I fell into company with them for kind of obvious reasons. Anyway, the next morning, what happened was the Scotch whisky people got together and went to BA and demanded that they be put on Concorde in order to reach New York in time. And then somebody said, well, Mr. O'Sullivan's name is not on the list. They said, no, he's a late addition. So I flew to Concorde, courtesy of the Scotch Whisky Association. Now, that, of course, was a distinguished career, but then later, Lord Frost went out of the civil service and into politics. Meteoric, because, of course, he went almost instantly into the cabinet and and both as a civil servant and as a politician, he was the man who led the British negotiations, which broke the political deadlock over Brexit, finally took the UK out of the EU, and put in place the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is the world's broadest free trade agreement. He subsequently served as a Minister for EU Relations in the Johnson government, but resigned rather than support a further lockdown to deal with the pandemic in 2021. I happened to be in the speech which announced that in London, and I remember the impact it made, and rightly so. He is now a Conservative peer in the Lords and a writer for the Daily Telegraph, and there is no one better, I think, to answer the question about the future of the Conservative Party, and I warmly invite you, Lord Frost, to address us.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to the Danube Institute for hosting me and allowing me to speak in this marvellous setting, which is so much better than any think tank in London, I can tell you. Now, I'm sure there are lots of good Conservatives here tonight, but it's a particular privilege to be allowed to give my amateur thoughts on this subject in a forum with John, who has, of course, been at the vanguard of Conservative thought and action across the West for so many years, and who continues to argue for freedom and Western civilization at every opportunity. So thank you for having me in particular, John. Now, I can answer the question in my title, has British Conservatism lost its way? I can answer that straight away. There's no real doubt about it. British Conservatism has certainly lost its way. And that's not a value judgment. That is a judgment based on this polling. And it shows the party at 20 to 25% of the vote. Actually, there was a poll this morning which has caused some ructions in London, which shows us on 19%. But it's the worst poll ranking for many years. And really, this chart shows that for all the ups and downs, and I've highlighted some of them in red, for all the ups and downs, there's really only one story, which is down pretty consistently from 50% towards 20%. And so, as things stand, the party is heading for a very severe defeat when the election comes later on this year. So the question is not so much, have we lost our way, so much as how and why have we lost our way, and what can we do about it? Does that work? Should we go back to the main header so we don't get mesmerised by this poll? Does it work? It doesn't work. Never mind. Don't worry. We will manage it. Now, I'll come on to this one. Now, it's easy and tempting to answer the question in the title by reference to the specific failures of the last few years. In particular, the ousting of Boris Johnson, the unsatisfactory Liz Truss interlude, and the installation of our current Prime Minister without any sort of competition within the party, and, as it seems, without a huge amount of electoral appeal either. Now, those factors do play a part, obviously, but in many ways they're just symptoms of bigger structural political problems, and that they are making manifest those deeper failings. And it's those I want to dwell on tonight. First, by setting out the challenges I think Britain faces. Second, by explaining how the Conservative Party has generally failed to master those challenges. And third, and finally, by suggesting very briefly what we might do about them. Before I come on to this, I just want to make a couple of preliminary points. First of all, is to note that this lecture is really about domestic politics. Certainly the last 15 years have been fascinating for observers of, and indeed people like me who participated in British foreign policy making. The issue of foreign relations, with the obvious exception of Brexit itself, hasn't really been a decisive issue in what's gone wrong for the party in recent years. And as always, all politics is domestic. The second preliminary point to make is to note that although I'm going to say various difficult things in this lecture about the state of the UK and about the Conservative Party, they shouldn't be taken in isolation. They don't reflect a total picture. Britain still has some very important strengths. Crucially, we've restored our democracy and, at least potentially, removed our policy making from the dead hand of the big state, high regulation EU model. And as a result, we are better positioned, certainly, than many EU member states, especially those stuck in the rickety and dysfunctional Eurozone, which Hungary has been so wise to stay out of. All the gloomy predictions about Brexit, still so widely and gleefully repeated by the Financial Times, Bloomberg, and others, have proven untrue. There's been no visible or meaningful economic impact from Brexit. The country still has world-class research, higher education, and services sectors. We also have remarkable political strengths. Britain was the first country to dig itself out through its own strengths from the pandemic lockdown psychology at the end of 2021. And as John said, that's the issue I resigned as a minister over. And in general, in the British system, it remains difficult to suppress debate on issues that public opinion really wants to talk about. So I think still by European standards, Britain remains remarkably successful. It's just that European standards are not nowadays quite good enough. Now, quite a lot has also gone wrong, and that's why we find ourselves where we are, facing a set of challenges that are as serious as any faced since the war. So let's move on to the first part of my lecture, the challenges and stresses facing the UK. So in my view, the UK faces three big challenges, and let me just spend a moment setting these out. The first of the challenges is economic, and it's most starkly illustrated by the weakening growth in per capita GDP over the last 15 years, and the fact that in the last 2 years it's actually turned negative. All this has many causes, and I won't go into them now, but just to list some, the extreme dysfunction of our planning system and our health service, the regional and sectoral distortions created by the integration of the UK into the EU single market, the pernicious post-2008 consequences of zero interest rates with a resultant collapse in productivity, the growth of a very collectivist mindset in politics generally, resulting from the 2008 crash and its consequences, the growth and innovation destroying net zero policies, and the legacy of the lockdowns, the gradual establishment of benefits culture, and finally the need for mass immigration as an unsatisfactory palliative for all those strains. The result has been to extinguish growth, to push up the tax and spending burden, and to turn Britain into an inefficient, permanent, collectivist social democracy. That's the economic problem. The second set of challenges may be less obvious from overseas, and particularly perhaps to continental European observers. It stems from the importation of broadly European governance methods into Britain's unwritten and constantly evolving constitution over the last 50 years. Now, although the underlying causes can be found in membership of the ECHR and the European Union, and indeed, unfortunately, in the deep-rooted declinism of much of the British establishment since the war, I would say the stressors didn't really develop in earnest till the late 90s. And from that time on, there has been constant intrusion into the UK system from elements familiar in European constitutions. For example, a higher so-called Supreme Court, which is not, but has pretensions to be, superior to the national legislature. The restriction in practice of the concept of parliamentary sovereignty, the growth of a set of national laws with semi-constitutional status, which we've never had before, the increasing intrusive supervision of government actions by the courts, the emergence of a civil service which sees itself not as an advisor to government or implementer of decisions, but as a sort of repository of ideological values and a constitutional check in its own right. And the intrusion of international law into domestic law. Moreover, we also came to believe, or many Brits came to believe, that the UK was not the unitary state that we had all thought that it was, but rather some sort of multinational creation of 4 separate entities, more like a federal state, with every part in principle entitled to secede. Now, in short, confidence in the UK's traditional ways of doing things has waned. And the problem is that despite our departure from the EU, many of those who rule us are still mentally in this technocratic world. They're still in the world of international control and international supervision, and they lack the confidence or the desire to break out from it. And that is the governance problem. The third challenge is one which I think you will well recognise here in Hungary, which is the gradual replacement of classically Western values with postmodernist, in inverted commas, woke thought, a process which has dramatically accelerated in the last decade or so. It's played itself out differently in every country, but in Britain, the most visible effects of this so far, I think, are the more intrusive constraints on free speech, the decline of the belief in objective truth in many academic areas, and the chip on the shoulder about colonialism and Britain's historical record generally, the growth of an actively anti-religious and anti-Christian culture from one that was merely secular and neutral, the focus on group rights, diversity, and what divides us, rather than what unites us on individualism, on excellence, on national cohesion. And what is becoming increasingly clear is a reflex push by lots and lots of institutions towards progressive societal change. And that is the values problem. Now, the combination of these 3 problems is why we, the country, we, the party, find ourselves where we are. Now, as I said, all Western countries have been subject to some of these trends, but they've perhaps been particularly dramatic in the UK, partly because our constitution was always a bit idiosyncratic by European standards. And so European law and international supervision has had a particularly wrenching effect on us. But also because the revolution in British economic prospects, which took place under the Thatcher and Major governments, was so much based on the values of individualism, of freedom, of free markets, precisely the elements that are now under such significant attack. And altogether, all this accounts for the sense that many in the UK feel of disturbance, of something having gone wrong in our political life. And for many, and this is where I come to the point of the lecture, deep, deep frustration that all this has happened under 14 years of Conservative government. And the failure to get to grips with these problems is why so many Brits will say something like, and I quote, "The Tories have been in power for 14 years and have achieved nothing much." As I noted earlier, that's not quite fair, but I think it is understandable that people feel that. And anyway, for a politician, there's no point in arguing with the electorate. The electorate is always right. What you've got to do is try and persuade the electorate. And the Conservative Party's failure, our failure to do that, accounts for the political problem that we now have. And quite simply, that problem is that, indeed, according to the poll that came out this morning that I mentioned, 2/3 of those who voted for us in 2019 don't plan to vote for us now. Not many of them have gone to Labour. Some have gone to Reform Party on the right, but still more are simply saying they will not vote, they won't turn out. The political task for the Conservative Party is to bring those voters back, and so far we've failed to do so. So, what is the main explanation or reason why we've not done this? Now, in my view, there are five broad sets of problems that got us to where we are, and they are briefly the following. First, deep ideological confusion in the party. Second, the failure to get to grips with the economic problem that I talked about just now. and our failure to explain what's necessary to fix it. Third, the unwillingness to address the decline in state authority that I talked about. Fourth, the neglect of those values changes in the country that I mentioned. And fifth, the persistent temptation that we felt to pivot back to a narrow and insufficient social and geographic basis for our vote, and one that is not wide enough to actually win an election from. Now, let me take a look at each of these in turn. First of all, we've got to a point where there's huge ideological flabbiness and confusion in the party. And this stems ultimately from a lack of hard thinking of what the party is supposed to be about. It has, of course, always been true, and famously, that the Conservative Party is a broad church containing many different kinds of opinion. That is true, and it's a strength. But it still can't contain every kind of opinion if it's going to be successful. And this is where this chart that you've all had a chance to familiarise yourself with comes in. If you look at it, it's one of these familiar 2x2 charts. You've got the axis in the centre between free markets and sort of statism on the economic axis, and then you've got one running from left to right, which is about values, with sort of social liberalism, progressivism on the left, and conservatism and nationhood on the right. And what this chart is trying to show is that the traditional Conservative Party, until maybe 20 years ago, actually contained quite a range of views on economics, but was given a kind of anchor and cohesion by the fact that it had a broad belief in the nation and in its institutions and in social conservatism generally. Now, if you look at, hopefully this will go, yeah, if you look at where Labour was in the same period, you can see there's a pretty clear difference between the two offers of the party. Now, all this has changed in recent years, and I would say, first of all, it was the Blair government and then the response of the Conservative Party to what it saw as the trends of the Blair government. And this is what the Conservative Party looks like now. So the accommodation to the trends of secular progressivism and liberalism and the changes, in particular, the changes in the composition of the parliamentary party, which has gone with this, has dragged the party across that spectrum to the progressive left in part. It's now all over the political spectrum, socially and economically, and in fact, I would say there is almost no political proposition that you can't find someone in the party to support. In support of that proposition, I note that a Conservative MP this autumn threatened to sue the Prime Minister over the government's support for Israel over Gaza, which one might not think is a typically Conservative Party proposition, but nevertheless happened. So if you look at where Labour is now, you can see the problem. There's a huge area of overlap, and hence a huge problem in distinguishing ourselves ideologically in the electoral arena. And as a result, strong Conservatives are drifting away from the party, as I mentioned in those polls. Now, this ideological vacuousness has had major consequences in all areas, and notably the second area I want to talk about, which is the fact that we haven't got to grips with what's gone wrong in the economy over the last 20 years. Although the party may not have always been explicit about it, we took the view that there had, since the start of the century, been a durable shift to the Washington consensus, or to the left, if you like. They're the same thing nowadays. We took it for granted that economic growth could always be generated in that way, that the growth problem was essentially solved, and that politics was all about, as it was put at the time, and I quote, sharing the proceeds of growth. So we failed to explain that growth doesn't just appear, it has to be created. And of course, it hasn't just appeared. It has been weakened by global trends, but also by our own actions. We went along with the view, which was a heresy in the Thatcher era, but reintroduced into the British body politic under Labour, that the state had to be deeply involved in the economy and in protecting individuals from risk. We not only took for granted the society-changing policy of net zero, we chose to double down further on the socialist view that you could only deliver net zero through command and control, not through the market, and by a regression in technology to wind power rather than through advance to modern gas and nuclear. There are many other things I could cite in this context, but without labouring the point, we found ourselves dealing with an increasingly serious economic problem with our opponents' arguments as the ones we've been using and the only available tools that we're ready to put to the electorate. Instead of explaining how a modern economy works and why and what the trade-offs are, we have accepted unchallenged certain progressive and socialist presumptions about the modern economy and the role of the state within it. And since we're given the impression that growth can be determined by state action, many voters conclude that since the economy is bad, the government must be to blame for it. All the pedagogical work that was done in the Thatcher era, which was necessary and which did change public attitudes, has been lost. We've no reservoir of arguments to make to the British people now we do face a genuine economic problem, other than, as Boris Johnson once put it, to promise that, I quote, the government will put its arms around the British people. And that is a promise that we no longer have the money for. Moreover, because in fact many people across the country are Conservatives and do not accept those propositions and in fact want to see Conservative policies, once again our vote has begun to fray away at the edges. Now, our third problem is the failure to deal with state and governance weakness. Now, the ideological feebleness that's on display there means that to the extent we do make an appeal to the electorate, it is based on a pragmatic administration of a given status quo. It's about administrative competence rather than ideology. And there is always a risky appeal for a Conservative Party, in my view, and especially so in a country where the establishment and elites are broadly progressive in outlook. And so it has proved for us. If you come to the UK much, you will very often hear people saying something like, and I quote, "It feels like we can't get anything done in this country anymore." And I don't think they're wrong in thinking that. In fact, I think it's very true, and it has a number of causes. One of them is all those governance weaknesses I referred to earlier, the web of treaties and constraints and courts that clog up the business and government and exclude some policy options right from the start. There's the refusal to reform our 19th century civil service model. There's the fact that our independent public institutions, the police, universities and so on, are allowed to define their own goals and act as they wish, rather than according to what the government wants, as we've seen in the loss of authority in policing those huge demos in London in recent weeks. All our infrastructure projects seem to get bogged down in red tape and planning law and in process and legal challenge. And there's the inability to control our borders, most famously with the small boats problem on the south coast, where we're tied up once again in these international legal commitments. And finally, there's the huge issue of legal migration, where people see that successive governments, including successive Conservative governments, have promised to get legal migration net down to under 100,000, and yet it's currently running at 750,000. Now, there's a sense that many people have that whatever the government says and whatever it promises, it either doesn't have the power or it doesn't have the will to change the situation. And indeed, if I had to identify one issue that is corroding the Conservative Party's prospects, it's that inability to control migration and to deal with all its economic, social and cultural consequences. On to the fourth problem. The failure to engage in the change in values in wider society. And as I noted, until recently, the Conservative Party was the party of the nation and social conservatism. and until quite recently, belief in those things was so widely and deeply entrenched that we didn't feel the need to spell them out as a kind of policy proposition. For most of the Conservative Party's history, it's been possible to take certain things as read. A belief in Britain as a valuable and basically successful nation state, an understanding that our history was something to be generally proud of, certainly something that had shaped us, an acceptance that the family was the fundamental basis of a free society, and behind all that, a view that individuals were expected generally to make their own way in the world and to get on with their own lives, and that the government didn't have the right to interfere in certain areas. Now, all that was so taken for granted until quite recently that we didn't see the need to make the explicit case for these things. To the extent that we spotted that this values change was happening, we saw it's the general social and political modernisation which we could safely go along with, rather than what it actually is, of course, which is a semi-Marxist ideological undermining of the basis of Western society. So, we didn't make the case for core Conservative propositions around nationhood. When we woke up, and in our case it was mainly through Brexit and the debate about migration that I've talked about, we realised that many fewer people believed in those things than we had thought. We discovered suddenly after the Brexit referendum that the German concept of the nation state, i.e. that it was basically a bad thing, had got very widely spread in Britain. Amongst the young and amongst the progressive establishment. We realised that many people simply did not believe in borders, thought that in principle anybody in the world had the right to come to the UK, and certainly didn't agree that British state authorities had got the right to stop them. We suddenly discovered that national heroes like Churchill had become controversial figures, and that many people had a very partial understanding of the achievements of Britain. And all this reached its apogee, or probably it isn't its apogee actually, but the recent last weekend when we discovered that those responsible for rehanging landscape paintings in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, one of Britain's greatest museums, had put up captions which suggested that appreciating paintings of the British landscape could risk turning people into far-right activists. So if you ever fancied goose-stepping in front of a constable or something, you now know why. What all this means is that this Conservative Party has got to be ready to address those issues much more explicitly than in the past. And that includes setting out the case for Brexit. We can't just assume that people think the British nation state is a good thing. We've got to persuade them. And unfortunately, we've discovered that many Conservative parliamentarians are even uncomfortable with this and regard it all as a bit kind of embarrassing. That isn't going to be good enough. If we as a party can't make ourselves do this, then who else is going to do it? The fifth and final problem is our pivot back to a rather narrow social and electoral base, in many ways the party's comfort zone. In 2019, the Boris Johnson government won a big election victory on the back of a very wide electoral coalition. We defeated the Liberals in the southwest, and we beat Labour in wide areas of northern England, the so-called Red Wall, because it had been Labour for a very, very long time. Now, many people in the Conservative Party seem to have felt there was something artificial about this coalition. The voters who weren't really Conservatives had been drawn in by the need to vote to get Brexit done, as the slogan had it, and by the deep unpopularity of the far-left Labour leader of the time, Jeremy Corbyn. They drew the conclusion that the Conservative Party had involuntarily, by chance, acquired some leftish voters, and therefore we needed to give them leftish policies if we were going to keep them on board. As I've called that the red wall fallacy. And what this did was produce what we saw, a drift towards unconservative policies, towards tax rises, higher public spending on industrial policy, more spending wastefully on the health service, and so on and so forth, and above all, once again, a neglect of immigration policy, which took us further away from our conservative roots. Now, the tragedy is that this is based on a complete misapprehension. The 2019 coalition was absolutely in line with the tradition of the Conservatives as a national party. If you look back to the Thatcher years, Margaret Thatcher won votes in the 1983 election in exactly the same places in the north as Boris won them in 2019. In fact, right back to the middle of the 19th century, almost to the beginning of the party that John talked about, whenever the Conservative Party won elections, it won them by winning in exactly those areas. What actually happened in 2019 was that we finally won over, because of Brexit and because of Jeremy Corbyn, we won over people who were Conservatives. These are people by all normal markers of politics, income, lifestyle, family, job, housing, aspirations, should already have been Conservative voters. But the strength of Labour tradition and the folk memory of hostility to Margaret Thatcher had until that point kept them Labour. It was Brexit, it was Corbyn that finally brought them over. And when they came over, what they wanted was Conservative policies because they were fundamentally Conservatives, not socialist ones. And unfortunately, we failed to deliver that. Our unconservative, socially liberal and ideologically flabby approach drove those new voters away. In turn, it became much easier for the party, more ideologically and politically congenial, to focus on the core vote, a so-called core vote in southern England. Now, unfortunately, it's precisely those voters, relatively wealthy voters in southern England, who are disproportionately anti-Brexit, culturally and socially liberal, and generally not particularly attuned to conservative values. Now, of course, that had always been true to some extent, but we kept such voters loyal in the privacy of the voting booth by a simple appeal to self-interest, that is, primarily low taxation. Now, we're not even doing that either, and as a result, the appeal is waning. So in short, what we're seeing is a lack of understanding of our new electorate, an intellectual failure to think through the strategy, and a failure to deliver core Conservative policies has alienated voters across the country, old and new. Nobody is getting what they want, and that's why they're not voting for us. This does have one other consequence, and it's that we're doing almost nothing for young people. I was interested to hear earlier today somebody telling me how strong young people's support was relatively for Fidesz here. That is certainly not true in the UK. Our voters, particularly in southern England, are disproportionately elderly, wealthy, hostile to building houses and infrastructure, and our policies have reflected that. We're about 4 million houses short for our population, and as a result, we've got the highest house prices in Europe. Young people are being priced out, are unable to leave home, they can't form families, and the normal shift of young people from youthful leftism to middle-aged conservatism is simply not happening in Britain. Incredibly, the Conservatives have only got 7% of voters aged under 25. We've only got 14% of voters aged under 50. So the party is, unless we could change that, the party is sort of dying out. And it really isn't sustainable. So in short, we've got an older, southern, privileged, property-owning voting base. People who are doing all right, despite all the challenges. It's good that people like that vote Conservative. I certainly don't want to drive them away. But the problem is there isn't enough such people to actually win an election with. And worse, the perception that that's who we're focusing on weakens the Conservative Party brand. Our opponents have always accused us of being the party of the rich, the party that likes sort of grinding the face of the poor. And if we appear to be making an actual appeal primarily to the rich, the wealthy, the people who are doing all right, then that is going to have some credibility. So we need to behave like a national party, not one that's retreated to its lager in southern England. And if we do, that way lies a strategic defeat. So to finish up, what is to be done? A lot to be said, and I won't say it all. But the good news is that, in my view anyway, it isn't too late to change the approach and bring at least some voters back, just as Boris Johnson did in 2019. If I can get back to the very first chart. What it doesn't show you is that just before the beginning of that chart, in June 19, the Conservative vote in the so-called Euro elections was 9%. So it's not even on the chart. Boris, in 6 months, turned that round to election winning 43%. So you can do it. You can do it if you do the right things. At the moment, we aren't doing the right things, and we'll certainly have to have the argument about what the right approach is after the election, it seems, and in all likelihood in opposition. But whenever that argument happens, various things are a prerequisite for getting it right. First of all, we've got to be honest with people. We have to say we can't go on as we are. There's no easy way out of the mess, but failure to tackle it only makes it worse. We have to get on with it. We also have to tell voters, and we have to believe it ourselves, that there is no point in taking measures which may be politically possible, but which can't actually solve our problems. The task of politicians is instead to make politically possible the measures that are actually needed to resolve the problems of the country. And those are going to be radical measures. They're going to be difficult measures. They're going to be far-reaching measures. But there's no point in doing less than that, because anything less than that is not going to solve our problems. Now, my view is that we need a huge reform programme on a scale that's not currently well understood over a 5 to 10 year period. We should have been making the case for this already, but the best time to start is now. And that programme involves both less state and more state. And that's one of the political challenges for getting it across. As regards the economy, we need less state. There's no future for the country as a high-tax, high-spend social democrat economy. We need to get tax and spending levels down. We need to reform planning. We need to reform the health system. We need to remove the crushing burden of net zero and bring back industry. We're going to need a huge programme of deregulation of the labour market, planning and environmental measures, and the business environment. That is the only way we are going to get growth back. And if we don't get growth back, we're not going to solve any of the other problems either. At the same time, we need more state where the state is the only possible actor. And that means a huge improvement in state effectiveness. We need a state that does its job properly, manages the institutions effectively, puts in place a system of governments that works, controls the borders, funds defence properly, controls the streets, defeats extremism, stands up for the nation, its history, pushes back on postmodern ideas in public institutions. And in my view, these two things go together, more and less state in the right areas. They aren't contradictory. You don't get a successful, cohesive nation state if you're not delivering acceptable levels of economic growth. And you don't get those levels of economic growth if people don't feel they are part of a cohesive, supportive national project, because that's the only way they'll put up with the churn and the change and the turbulence that comes with a successful market economy. Those two things have to go together. And finally, and self-evidently, the Conservative Party itself has got to decide where it stands on those questions and whether it is ever capable of delivering this kind of programme. Before too long, it has got to narrow down those ideological options and decide where it sits on those charts. And that is going to be painful, considering our starting point. But we have to get to a point where people understand what you're getting if you vote Conservative, and at the moment they just don't. To conclude, every time we have offered a clear right-wing Conservative philosophy at elections, which has happened all too rarely, we have won handsomely in 1983, in 1987, and again in 2019. And when we have not done that, we have failed to win. This reflects the fact that there are large numbers of British people who still want to see traditional Conservative policies, who still believe in the traditional virtues of conservatism, economic, social cohesion, and want a party that delivers them. If we can persuade people that we haven't given up on that, we still have a chance this year. And if we can't persuade them, I very much fear a very serious defeat and a lot of recriminations ahead. Thank you very much.
Would you like to take your seat? David, that was a marvellous tour d'horizon of the fate and the situation of the Conservative Party. I'm really grateful to you, and I think we've all can learn a great deal from it. And now I'd like to invite some immediate comments from three young scholars who are at the moment serving time as fellows at the Danube Institute. I'm going to ask each of them to come forward. First of all, Nathan Levine. Nathan, you describe yourself as an analyst and consultant on economic politics and international affairs. I think we're living in a new great age of pamphleteering, and I think that you are, in fact, a new electronic pamphleteer of genius. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the program. And there are other things. I mean, you are a China expert and so on and so forth. But thank you very much for being here. Secondly, I'm going to invite a new fellow here, Lana Clarkson. Sorry. We've only just met each other because I've been away while she's been here for the first time. So welcome and thank you. And David Oldroyd-Bolt, historian, broadcaster, specializing in the history of the Conservative Party since the Second Reform Act, appearing regularly in British television, radio, and I think, in particular, you have a starring role kind of in the GB News, which is one of the new organizations in English journalistic life. So I'm going to ask first if Nathan would, from a seated position, I think, would deliver the first remarks, and then we'll go on with Lana, and then the second time, and finally, David Oldroyd-Bolt. Thank you very much, Nathan.
This is working? All right. So first of all, thanks for the invitation. It was great to hear the remarks. They struck me as eminently sensible. So I'm not sure there's really anything in the remarks for me to disagree with. That being said, I did think they might rather understate the case, if anything, of the seriousness of the situation, in my view, for the Conservative Party in Britain, and perhaps for other parties that are conservative as well in the West. I mean, maybe I'll start with a quote from an article that I read this morning from what I would describe as an influential right-wing commentator among the young British right. And he was writing in support of the zero seats movement, with an exclamation point at the end, which intends to deprive the Tory party of any seats whatsoever from the right. And this is a quote from his article. "The compulsion to see the Tory party destroyed has crossed the bounds of political pragmatism and entered a mode of pure hatred, with an implicit understanding that the party is a mortal enemy to be annihilated, regardless of the cost. In a sense, none of this matters, because for a huge swath of the people in Britain, the Conservative Party has become a symbolic stand-in for everything loathsome and detestable about the country. We have all become little Ahabs, and the Tory party has become our white whale. Towards thee I roll, thou all-destroying but unconquering whale. To the last I grapple with thee. From hell's heart I stab at thee. From hate's sake I spit my last breath at thee." This is not a Labour voter. This is the former core of the British young right voters for the Conservative Party. So I think the question is why is there such this sense of antagonism to the Conservative Party in Britain? And I think the obvious reason is that they feel they've been completely betrayed. And I think that betrayal has much to do with many of the things you already mentioned in your remarks, especially immigration. But in particular on immigration, I think that the issue is that it's not that it was not a matter of accident that there was this wave of uncontrolled immigration into the country post-Brexit, but rather that the deliberate decisions of the Tory party after Brexit to encourage this large wave of migration, legal migration from the from parts of the world other than the EU has been tremendously disruptive. So the real issue for the Tory party, in my view, is that the policies have been somewhat catastrophic, and therefore the base has good reason to feel that they have been betrayed on an issue like immigration, in addition to the broader problem of the party being unable, it seems, to control the irregular migrations from the small boats, and sort of claiming as an excuse, as some would see, the limits of international law and so on. The other issue, though, that I had mentioned that I would add to your remarks, I mean, you mentioned the issue of free speech and sort of runaway progressivism. But again, this is not and obviously this is coming from the left, the progressive left, these issues. But the primary threat to free speech and free discourse in Britain comes not from the universities or the activists of the left these days, but from the state itself. I would say that as an American, at least, it's quite shocking to see the degree that the United Kingdom has degenerated into what we might call democratic backsliding, of a situation in which people opposed to the government and its policies in the United Kingdom are routinely now arrested and jailed for thought crimes on issues in British politics, such as Sam Melia, a man who was just imprisoned for 2 years for the crime of passing out stickers opposed to immigration. So when the Tory base sees the issue of what they see as the betrayal of themselves in the country, they see not just the opposition, the Labour Party or whoever else oppressing them, so to speak, but the British state itself, which is represented by the Conservative Party as they are in the majority. So I think what they see is that the establishment sees them, their own base, as much of a threat as the left or extremists, so to speak, from wherever. And we've seen that in the new definition of extremism that was just released, that sort of makes a point of targeting nationalists in the right wing as dangerous a threat as jihadists. So I think that what we've seen is a party base that really feels a sense of antagonism that goes beyond economic issues and so on, as important as those may be. And so I think that if the question is what can be done to win back loyalty from voters who have abandoned the Conservative Party, I think that's actually quite straightforward. It's to really tackle immigration, to impose a moratorium on further immigration until a coherent system can be implemented, to send the British Navy to stop the small boats forcefully, to repeal some of the legislation that has most impacted free speech, like the Equality Act, to purge the police and the security services of far-left influences, to defund the NGOs that seem to have such an influence on policy, all these things. But I think we know that this isn't going to happen. And the Tories have some good reasons to say we can't do that. We can't get those kind of rapid changes through the bureaucracy and the courts, which is true. But I think that points to what is an even bigger problem, a broader problem, which is that for many, especially many young people in Britain, and indeed around the West, the sense is that there is no longer any democratic legitimacy, democratic sovereignty within the system, because the actual levers of power are all in the hands of unelected, unaccountable managerial elite in the bureaucracy that cannot be gotten rid of no matter how you vote. And so, therefore, they're willing to destroy their own party, or their former party, because they're essentially completely hopeless. So I think that's the broader issue that we're looking at here, is a broader issue of democratic legitimacy in the West.
Nathan, thank you very much. Lana Starky, I apologize before, and I should add that you are, of course, a fellow of the Institute of Political Affairs in Melbourne, which is one of the two great conservative think tanks in maybe there are others, but they're the two I at least know. So welcome here, because you've just arrived, and secondly, let's hear your remarks.
Thank you very much, John. My comments relate quite a lot to what you said, Nathan. They relate to the governance problem, but with a focus specifically on these values. And the replacement of these classical Western values with what you termed postmodern woke thought. So I recently reviewed Professor Doug Stokes' 2023 book Against Decolonization, Campus Culture Wars and the Decline of the West. So in this, he examines the decolonization movement in its British context, where following the killing of George Lloyd in 2020 and accusations that British universities are systemically racist, the idea that universities must adopt this decolonization process to atone for slavery, colonialism, all the legacies of these forms of historical oppression has taken hold. Now, this is all quite familiar to us, of course, and in Australia we have this as well. But what I found interesting is that Stokes identifies Britain's 2019 Equality and Human Rights Commission reports, which purported to show that racism is endemic in Britain's higher education sector. He highlights these as central to a broad moral panic about racism across UK campuses at this time, and they were picked up by media outlets worldwide. But Stokes takes their subsequent effect on university policy, however, as deeply concerning. And he finds that the Universities UK, the UK's preeminent body for university vice-chancellors, not only kowtowed to the EHRC reports, but doubled down. They asserted that there was an epidemic of racism across British campuses that benefits white people who as a collective group benefit from structural racism overall. So this is just deeply rooted in decolonization theory, of course. You are racist by virtue of being white. Their solution was, of course, the DEI, bureaucracy, micromanagement of campus cultures, and in 2020 they released a report tackling racial harassment in higher education that Stokes writes sent a powerful and unmistakable message to university vice-chancellors, and this hardwired the decolonization agenda into British universities. And this was all effectively based on these EHRC reports. And their role cannot be understated. So this seems to me to be an example of what you identified in the governance problem, as the emergence of a civil service which sees itself not as advisor and implementer, but a repository of ideological values in its own right. And so in 2019, when these pernicious reports were released, the chair of the EHRC was David Isaac, and at this time the commission was described as Great Britain's national human rights institution, as provided for by the UN human rights system, the national equality body as required by the EU race and gender directives. So my first question is quite simple. Is the Equality and Human Rights Commission still subject to EU race and gender directives post-Brexit? I assume not. And I understand that the current head of the EHRC is Kishwir Faulkner, Baroness Faulkner, who took on the role in December 2020. It seems that she's doing good work to reverse the damage done under David Isaac, I note that her first act was to withdraw the EHRC from the Stonewall Champions scheme, which under David Isaac was the lone lobby group apparently responsible for balancing human rights. I also note good work in that she has been criticized by the left for being transphobic, following comments she made in the Times when she said that women had the right to question transgender identity without abuse, fear of stigmatization, and loss of employment. And more recently, under Baroness Faulkner, the EHRC has been criticized by the left for supporting the proposal to amend the Equality Act to clarify that sex is a protected characteristic, refers to biological sex. So for me, this looks promising, and I see this as the Conservatives making a case for traditional values and this undermining of what you correctly identified as the Marxist ideological undermining of the basis of Western society. In these particular cases, the family or traditional gender roles as the fundamental basis of a free society are what the Conservatives seem to be doing. However, having read Stokes' book, it seems that at the universities at least, the rot has well and truly set in. Your comments on Churchill having now become a controversial figure, and these preposterous changes at the Fitzwilliam Museum remain deeply concerning. So my question is, does the Conservative Party have a coherent plan, short of a great purge of the universities and other bodies overrun by Marxist zealots, to somehow defend British culture and Western civilization? You noted the problem of Conservative parliamentarians being uncomfortable about making the case for core Conservative propositions around nationhood. But then there is also the question of how the Tories will be able to distinguish themselves from other far-right parties, or how they'll be able to draw voters from far-right parties. This is, I suppose, the ideological flabbiness. I'd like to know who are the main actors on this front. I'm thinking through these really large questions on history and national identity.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Lord Frost, I largely agree with your analysis of how the Conservative Party has gone wrong, but I think you post-date the problem. Has British Conservatism lost its way? Yes, and you know the date. It was the 22nd of November 1990. It was the day that Margaret Thatcher decided she was not going to run for the Tory party leadership again. Why that date? It's not because Thatcher was some extraordinary figure who could not be matched. It is because the Conservative Party, for the first time in its history since the formation of the party at the time of the Corn Laws, decided that it was going to exercise its historical ruthlessness at the wrong time. The Conservative Party's ruthlessness is one of the tropes of British politics. It's one of the things that is talked about as its reason for success over so many years. But that ruthlessness has to be, and usually was applied, at the time it would be electorally useful. And moreover, at a time when it would not create an enormous fissure within the Conservative Party itself. What we have seen in the past 34 years is the inevitable psychological, electoral, and internal consequence of botched matricide. If you kill Mummy and leave her sitting at the head of the table while the corpse rots, and you don't decide what you're going to do about that until it's far too late, there's going to be a problem at your family dinner party. If you decide, as they did in 2005, that the thing to do is to continue pretending she's not there, and that Daddy at the head of the table, who has a completely different set of beliefs and is still apparently a brilliant figure, is the one to emulate, viz. Not Tony Blair, the frontman, but Gordon Brown, the ideological underpinner of the entire New Labour movement, then your family is riven. The problem with the Conservative Party is an internal problem. It does not know what it is, and the 2-3 factions within it hate what each of them thinks it is. This has to be addressed. You cannot win elections, you cannot win populations, you cannot win votes if you are not giving them a coherent program. And moreover, if you give them the impression that you don't really believe what you're saying. I think one of the great problems is that the shall we call it the Cameron movement, David Cameron, George Osborne, Michael Gove, Ed Vaizey, not only didn't see the problem with Brownism, they rather approved of it. Their solution to it was not a solution at all. It was one of amelioration by degree. Amelioration by degree is not what was needed for the enormous expansion of the role of the state during those years in the guise of paternalism, because when you say 2008 and the pandemic were times when the state became the great god, I don't think that's true. I think it had long been in place, and it was long the Brownite idea. Immigration is part of this. Rubbing the right's face in immigration was a Labour Party policy from 1997 onwards. They were able to do it with much greater effect after the accession of Eastern European countries to the European Union. The expansion of the state into all aspects of life, the takeover of charities, of the academic institutions, of national bodies like, say, the National Trust, which is supposed to do with country houses. The placing in all of these institutions, and many, many more, of arts organizations, for instance, of people whose loyalty was not to the state, not to the good operation of national institutions, but to a highly socialistic, divisive set of beliefs and principles which they would operate on regardless of whoever was in power and regardless indeed of the desires of the members of these bodies, was one of the outstanding successes of the Labour Party and one of the outstanding failures of the Conservative government over the past 14 years. It has quite simply felt itself unwilling and unable to address this, as many Conservatives who were part of that modernisation project have now admitted. When I say that they hate each other, it was the Tory party from 2001 onwards, not least Mrs May at Conservative Party conference saying we're the nasty party, David Cameron referring to swivel-eyed lunatics, comments from within the leadership about its own activist members and members of Parliament that it heightened this impression that the Tory party was an unserious party, that it had no unified, cohesive thing to offer the British people, and that therefore it couldn't be trusted. The only reason the Conservative Party got into power in 2010, which if you remember was with a Liberal coalition, it was not a Conservative majority, was because people really disliked Gordon Brown. It was nothing to do with the popularity of the prospectus offered, nor of the popularity of Mr Cameron and his acolytes, and it was entirely a negative vote. Every single electoral success they have had has been a negative vote over these times. For instance, the 2019 coalition Conservative victory was a reaction against, on the one hand, Mr Corbyn, against, on the other hand, the belief that Brexit was about to be betrayed. And I think, though there were potential lessons to be learnt from that, as Lord Frost had embraced in his speech, these lessons have not been learnt. If anything, they have been rejected decisively. The Conservative Party, as currently constituted, and with the exception of one or two members of Parliament and one or two members of the House of Lords, does not want to represent the people who it could take on and represent, because they are snobbish about them. They think basically these are the deplorables of UK society. They don't want to represent them. They also, and this is a really fundamental psychological point, resent the fact that the Conservative Party is no longer the broad party of the establishment. It was for 150 years, until 1997, true that whichever party was in power, there was a broad, soft, small c conservatism to the establishment with a capital E. That changed entirely after 1997. They are still coming to terms with it. They resent it, and until they can unite all of these different, or rather solve all of these different psychological aspects, the Conservative Party will be utterly useless and will continue to mean that Britain becomes a more statist, more socialistic, and less pleasant place to live.
Well, can I just first of all ask you, David, to respond to what had been a series of criticisms that weren't really criticisms so much as disguised agreement, and to these 3 points, and then we'll throw it open to the floor. But could I just... I'm sorry?
We will not have time for questions.
How much time do we...
Not have time for
No, but what time is it now?
We have time for Lord Frost to respond, and then it's not no questions.
Okay. Well, I think... okay. So over to you. Over to you.
I won't. They were so thoughtful that they deserve a fuller response. But just a couple of quick points I wanted to make. Levels of anger amongst young people are huge, including amongst Conservatives, in my view. You know, you often kind of tap into it all of a sudden and are struck by the fury. So it's definitely out there. Lana, your point about the EHRC, it is improving. It's one of the good signs. The definition of sex, as opposed to gender, that you mentioned, I mean, that's a very good example of something where we never thought we had to defend it. When we wrote the Equalities Act, which refers to sex, nobody ever thought it meant anything other than biological sex. Now we find we've got to define that, and it's a good example of how we spotted what's going on. And very last point, in case anyone thought there was anything a little odd, David, about your analogy with Mrs. Thatcher sitting at the head of the table. I was struck when David Cameron, Lord Cameron, was reappointed Foreign Secretary in the UK government in November. A very prominent Conservative commentator just tweeted out, quote, "Daddy's home." And that told me a lot about the way Conservatives look at people in the party and the psychology of what has gone on.
Thank you. What time do we have at this point? 4? Okay, good, thank you. I have a couple of points I'd like to make, but on the other hand, I think the audience might want to say something. Yes, the gentleman here, this lady will give you a mic.
Thank you very much. My name is Béla Gedeon. I'm currently a PhD student in political science in Corvinus University in Budapest. Also formerly journalist for the Hungarian state media, MTI, Hungarian news agency. And thank you for this refreshing lecture and for the discussion. This is really, really interesting. And just two quick questions from a Hungarian perspective. First, I really enjoyed that graph that you've shown during your lecture, and I want to come back to the last part of it, or the end part of it. How much do you think that the personality of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has to do with the fact of the unpopularity of the Conservative Party, given the fact of Liz Truss's disastrous tenure? And the second question is, why do you think there was a failure on the part of the UK government to implement and import some of the successful policies from the Hungarian government of Prime Minister Viktor Orban, or for that matter, the Trump administration, such as the support of families, the fight against illegal immigration, or the fight against wokeism, etc. So why there wasn't no examples of importing those elements? Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Juan Daniel Gonçalves. I'm a Venezuelan Portuguese businessman, and honestly, isn't the Conservative Party at this point just past redemption? I speak as a Portuguese voter, and the rise of non-traditional, non-establishment alternatives to the right in Europe. Personally, I'm quite proud of the fact that Chega party is quite anti-establishment and proposes an alternative to Portugal, almost tripled its voter turnout in recent elections compared to our last performance. So perhaps it's past the point of trying to fix something that cannot be fixed. Thank you.
And this gentleman down here. This
Yes, my name is Theo Bash. Excellent presentation, of course, Lord Frost. The elephant in the room is the war in Ukraine. Macron sending troops. Will Britain attach itself to the effort? You guys are saying clearly that by the elections, the Conservative party in UK is gone, which means the left is taking over. Fine. EU is going the other way, hopefully, from left to right, if we're lucky. Okay. How will this play around? Will the UK support Macron? Will they support a right directed EU Parliament or not? Thank you.
Do you want me to answer? Yeah, I think the personality of the Prime Minister, the collapse of Liz Truss, lots of kind of random events of the last 3 or 4 years. They're part of the story, but I think we would be in fundamentally the same position if with different people around. The fundamental problem is ideological and policy, not leaders. Leaders can make it a bit worse. They dip the graph a bit, or they can improve it. They raise it. But I think the fundamental problems are much deeper than the particular leaders and the particular events that we have faced. I think why no learning from Viktor Orban or Donald Trump? I think you probably know or can guess at the answer to that. I think, having seen the Brexit process through, I think one quite deep bit of psychology, even among strong supporters of Brexit very often, was to prove to the world that we were not bad people. It was like, we've done this really bad thing, voted to leave the European Union, but we're not bad, really. Look, we don't like Trump, we don't like all these populists, we don't, we're really quite sort of pleasant here in Britain, despite everything. And I think that actually was a sort of antibody, almost. It kind of pushed us away from people that, with reservations, in certain cases, one can learn things from. On the Ukraine, on the EU, I think the UK has stopped kind of watching and caring very much what happens in the EU nowadays. I think there will be a shift. I mean, we should be, because we're still partly subject to the EU's legal order, unfortunately, in Northern Ireland. But if there is a shift to the right in the EU, I don't expect it to make any real difference to anything. It might slow things, it might change a few outcomes, but it won't change the general direction of travel in the EU. I warn Hungarians here.
Yes. I think we have to come to an end, but I have 2 points to propose to you, David, for a final word. A pessimistic and an optimistic one. The pessimistic one is 40 years ago, Manka Olsen wrote a book on why nations fail. And when she pointed out when a country is in a condition somewhat to the condition of England at the moment, the two easiest ways to get out of it were to be defeated in war or to engage in a major civil war. And there was a third, which is to say, undertaking a severe social crisis in order to change things around, which I think was what Thatcherism was, actually. But nonetheless, it's not something you can rely on to succeed. That's the pessimistic. The optimistic point is there's just been, but there is at the moment in the world, an extraordinary kind of silent institutional revolution of wokeness. And now we see in all kinds of places a rebellion against it. It looks to me as though whatever government succeeds, the Tory party is going to be committed to the wokeness revolution. And isn't that going to provide a very strong basis for the Conservative Party or any conservative movement reorganizing itself in opposition to the kind of silent revolution? And doesn't the Irish referendum give you hope?
Just quickly on this, well, yes, it does. I think there is a reaction. Again, I kind of remain to be persuaded that there is a strategic reversal of the trend, but there's definitely some resistance to it, and it's much easier to talk about it without being stigmatized than it was. It's definitely an opportunity for a proper Conservative Party to exploit this and to push back, which takes us back to the questions I raised. Can we get a grip on this? On your first point, the optimism or pessimism, I think one should be optimistic. Britain has got out of difficult situations before, and I'm reminded, I always quote Adam Smith, the famous economist, who I think one of his pupils said to him, if Britain carries out this policy, well, I forget what it was, but if Britain carries out this policy, the country will be ruined. And Smith replied, there's a good deal of ruin in a nation. In other words, you can get quite a lot of things wrong before they become irreversibly bad. And we have got quite a lot of things wrong, but it isn't irreversibly bad yet. And the party and the country can get a grip on it and recover.
David, you gave us an absolutely marvelous introduction to this discussion. More than that, it was a kind of recipe for some kind of revival of the right. And it was full, it seemed to me, of good ideas and persuasiveness, if only we could bend our thoughts properly to the task. Secondly, it stimulated both the three fellow speakers, and obviously, I think we have a lot more questions in this audience than we've been able to answer. We're being cut off by time. So I think my conclusion is you have to come back. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.